Today at Psychology Ninjas, it's the turn of Loftus and Palmer from Criminal Psychology, which is an optional content on paper 2. Loftus and Palmer's study is our classic study for criminal psychology. So when we're thinking about the maximum 6 AO1 marks that are available for these style questions, we're thinking about key details from that study. Specifics in terms of the aim, procedure, findings and conclusions. So how does this break down for our classic study? Well, we're thinking about the aim and you want to have 2. 1, testing the effect of post-event information. This is anything given to the participant after they have witnessed that event. Also, within that, we're testing the impact of leading questions, which is an example of post-event information. When we're talking about leading questions, we're saying anything in the question that is giving an indication of what we want the answer to be. For the procedure, you want to focus in on details that are going to help you evaluate. We've specifically looked at experiment 1, but you could do experiment 1 and 2 for the procedure and findings. Specific details in terms of the nature and type of sample, so opportunity and its students, and the stimulus, what the participants were shown. We know here it was clips of traffic accidents, and the more details you can give here the better, that these were between 5 and 30 seconds long, they were driver educational films, and you can go a step further saying that some of them were from the Seattle Police Department. The participants were asked one critical question. This was the only thing that changed, although there were other questions in there to prevent the participants from having demand characteristics. You want to try and identify as many of those 5 verbs as you can, with the dependent variable being the estimate of the car's speed in miles per hour. With findings, start broad and get narrower. Firstly, remember that smashed had the highest estimate and contact the lowest. Then try and give details in terms of the specific miles per hour. Again, you're looking for 2 conclusions, a bit like your aims, and both of those are around post-event information. Although we also know that this impacted the broader recall of memory, and that's more experiment 2, but it still works here for experiment 1. How are you going to evaluate? Well, we're still sticking with grave because this is a study. How does this break down? Well, in terms of population validity, we wanted to develop our logical chains of argument. But we might do that with 2 negatives, in terms of the participants all being students, so they had own age bias, where we tend to remember details that are similar to ourselves. We can also talk about cultural bias and that affecting schemas, which is a large part of leading questions. If we're then thinking about this, any time that you're talking about an unrepresentative sample, you also want to say that this limits the generalizability of the findings, in this case, in terms of post-event information. So, we're thinking about this as a 16 marker. We've upgraded for paper 2. We know that there's 6 marks of AO1 and 10 marks of AO3, and therefore we need to give more parts of grave. We've talked about our start point, where we talk about the aim and the nature of the participants, leading us nicely into our discussion about low population validity. We can then move through, giving our details about the procedure, and then linking that to reliability and consistency. We've started out here by saying there are consistent findings from similar research. Here I've given experiment 2, but you could talk about Loftus and Pickerel and lots of other pieces of research. Our counter-argument is coming from a different piece of research using a different research method, in this case, case studies. Yawn and Cutshaw's research was looking at bank robberies and witnesses of bank robberies in Canada, and they found accurate recall despite inclusion of misleading information. Here we've got an issue in terms of external reliability and inconsistent findings across different pieces of research, which suggests that other extraneous variables, such as anxiety, might be having an impact. We're moving through and we're talking about those findings. Remember, start broad, then get more specific. And this applies to real life. In 1976, as a consequence of Loftus and Palmer's research, the Devlin report suggested that juries should not convict based on a single eyewitness testimony. We also know, following this, that lots of convictions have been overturned since the introduction of DNA evidence. This also had an application in the development of the cognitive interview, with specific techniques such as reverse order and change perspective trying to prevent schemas and prevent those leading questions having an impact. All of this gives credibility to Loftus Palmer's work and external validity in terms of its applications. We're then moving through in terms of talking about our conclusions, and that actually these may lack external validity. We can talk here about the artificial environment, the lack of ecological validity for this study, but also issues with the mundane realism. Be careful here, because estimating speed is a logical thing, is a realistic thing that people would have to do with car accidents. What's not realistic here is the anxiety that we would have from a video clip rather than a real accident. We could alternatively talk about the fact that getting things wrong in the real world have more consequences, and therefore we would be less likely to make guesses. We're going to flip that and counter that with high levels of control. These are going to give us specific details in terms of the internal validity. Don't forget to not make this generic. Tell me how the stimulus was the same for all the people, how the lengths of footages were all between 5 and 30 seconds, that the only change was the critical question. Finally, we're going to give a final conclusion leading into a discussion about this being an ethically sound piece of research. Confidentiality in data. However, we might want to give a counter argument here that actually students may feel more obliged to take part in the study because it was in a university setting, and they may be more likely to guess and have different consequences than real witnesses. Let's move on to a different exam question. Here we've got a 2-mark question, but slightly tricky command word. We've got the command word compare. This is looking for one similarity and one difference, even at 2 marks. You're comparing Loftus and Palmer's research with other research into eyewitness testimony, which does give you quite a lot to talk about. Let's have a look at a different exam question. Here we've got an explain, one strength, one weakness of Loftus and Palmer. We want to think about this as 2 marks for our strength and 2 marks for our weakness. Split that down further, that's 1 mark for identifying a strength, 1 mark for identifying a weakness in context, which means it has to have specific things in relation to Loftus and Palmer. Also, within this, we get 1 mark, again, 1 for our strength, 1 for our weakness, for justifying it, for saying why that is a strength, why that is a weakness, why do we care about that identified point. So how does this break down in terms of our mark scheme? Well, again, we can say we've got similar findings from replications. Experiment 2 for Loftus and Palmer, again, focusing on the findings here, or Loftus and Pickrell. Then your justification is coming from, well, then we have external reliability, consistency in findings saying that post-event information is having an impact on eyewitnesses. For our weakness, we're going to talk about the fact that there's low population validity for this study. Here we're going to focus in on American students, that might lead to cultural bias in terms of leading questions, and a limited ability to generalise these findings to all witnesses who aren't American, who might have different impacts of leading questions. You could talk about students here instead, as long as you've got that link between representativeness and generalisability. Thanks for joining us today here at Psychology Ninjas. Don't forget to like, subscribe and hit that bell. See you next time.